substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to One of 200, the media and politics podcast. We've got another midweek episode for you. This one, very current events, but trying to do a little bit more of what they call a deep dive, a bit more focus on a singular issue instead of our usual cohort of different hates and loves for the week gone. I'm joined by my co-host and co-founder, Philip. How you doing?
Kia ora, mate. I'm good. I'm busy. I just recorded another podcast, so we're going to have a busy week, I think. Big week, really.
Fantastic. We're also joined by genocide researcher Kieran Kelly. Welcome back, Kieran.
Kia ora.
And what do we call you specifically? Journalist or war correspondent? Glen Johnson. You've covered Syria previously as well, so you have some on-the-ground experience there. How do you describe yourself now, Glen?
Oh yeah, I'm a freelance reporter, and I labor in between jobs now, so I get to do what I want.
Fantastic. I was hoping to hand it directly off to you, Glen, to talk about the conditions that brought us to the current conflict, that being the sudden incursion into government or regime-held cities in Syria by, do we call them rebels or terrorists or freedom fighters or just armed forces aligned against the regime, and the fall of the Assad regime alongside what's turned into an incredibly rapid divvying up of the country and resources by Israel, the US, and Turkey. Can you quickly tell the audience, what your experience with reporting on Syria has been? And I'm not going to ask you to say how we got here, but yeah, what were some of the conditions that predated the last week's events?
Well, obviously, Syria grew out of the big Arab revolts in 2011. So I was in Egypt throughout 2011, including when Hosni Mubarak was toppled. And then I was covering the Libyan transition in 2012, so the disintegration of the Libyan state. So you had the big uprisings, Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria was sort of the last of them to really pop off. For lack of a better phrase, and the conditions that gave rise to the Syrian uprising in 2011 were the same as similar to what they were throughout the Middle East. Principally, people not having money. There's a lot of talk in Western media about it being, these Western secular movements that want to replicate Western democracies, but that's not uniform across any of the different countries and the different sort of protest movements. So yeah, in Syria, principally, there was a lot of anger at the regime due to the sort of neoliberal reforms that Bashar al-Assad had enacted when he succeeded his father Hafez in 2000. And that particularly hit the agricultural sector, the urban poor. They moved into cities, cost of living increased, and it sort of, there was contagion once Egypt and Libya had gone off. We gradually saw the rebellion increase throughout 2011 in intensity. And again in 2012, we saw the foreign powers become involved. And this has just built since then with, an unfathomable sort of profusion of different local, regional, and international forces shaping the conflict in various ways. So that's a bit of background just to sort of start. So yeah, the past sort of week or 10 days, I believe what we've seen is Turkey was one of the major regional players in the conflict. So you had local dynamics, so kind of civil war, almost a class war, where you had the rebels coming in 2012 into Aleppo, so that rural poor coming into cosmopolitan Aleppo, looting, pillaging, so a kind of class element to the conflict. And you had the regional elements where Turkey in particular under Erdogan had what you call, I guess, a neo-Ottoman view of his role in the Middle East. And since 2016, when the rebels were driven out of eastern Aleppo, he's been provided a protectorate for them in Idlib province in the northwest. And yeah, I spent a bit of time in Idlib, Aleppo, Hasakah, so all around that region, north of Syria. And this was while a sort of peace process was going on, what was called the Astana Agreements. And it looks like Erdogan used time to build up various militias who are principally Salafi jihadists, so very austere Sunni Islamic fundamentalists. And when Assad didn't normalize relations, Erdogan basically had enough and sent these guys in, initially to Aleppo. Syrian army crumbled, down to Hama Homs, and now into Damascus. So that's basically what's gone on the past week or so.
Yeah, and there's also reports that Iran and Russia, who had given support to the Assad regime, had kind of warned that this was incoming, and Assad and the Syrian armed forces had kind of said, "Oh, we're just going to do tactical retreats," and no one had really bought that. And Iran, due to the last just more than 12 months, with the situation in Gaza and Lebanon, and this is one of those things that just hasn't been in Western media. The reasonably continuous bombing of Syrian positions by Israel during the same period of time that been bombing and undertaking genocide in Gaza and bombing and invading Lebanon have also left I guess Syria's allies incredibly stretched. So there's been less opportunity for them to come in and help stabilize those positions. And yeah, as you say, what do we call them? Do we call them rebels? Do we call them
You could say insurgents. I call them Salafi jihadists, personally.
The way they've just moved from city to city, alongside this Israeli incursion past the Golan Heights, which they've occupied for a fair amount of time as well. There's just been no force there to stop them at all. It's just happened. It's similar to perhaps the way the Taliban took back Afghanistan once the US pulled out.
Yeah, well, it's linked to, okay, so you've got the axis of resistance, and the Israelis have been carrying out a very obvious genocide in the Gaza Strip. That will soon probably move to the West Bank as well. But as part of this US-backed genocidal campaign about ultimately US hegemony in the region, they decapitated the Hezbollah. And this left the Syrian regime very, very vulnerable. So I don't believe it's orchestrated between the US, Israel, and Turkey. I think Israel is acting very opportunistically right now. It sees an opportunity to expand further. But yeah, this might be something for Kieran to jump in on.
I was just going to say something Carl was saying just before that it was wound up almost as if it seemed on purpose, that it was quite neatly done, that they packed up Assad, shot off, resigned first and left. It didn't look like the takeover of Mosul in Iraq, where it seemed like maybe there was subversion that allowed Islamic State forces to just gain a march on the place. It seemed more like it was coordinated.
Yeah, I mean, that's one question I wanted to ask your opinion of, Glenn, is what was the kind of, in your opinion, I guess, I don't think this is probably settled yet, but in terms of, I guess, military strategy or whatever it was, I think it happened faster than most people would have anticipated, right? The pace of advance and the pace of kind of tactical retreat and the kind of change in governing relations all happened faster than I think most people would have anticipated. So I just wondered what your kind of take was on that, from both from a kind of strategic perspective and from a media perspective. Like, why wasn't that anticipated, do you think?
Well, I don't believe Turkey was I thought they were up for a bit of a fight in Aleppo. So even they didn't anticipate it. We've seen Erdogan's language change quite a bit over the past week. And again, Erdogan was trying to force Assad to negotiate and normalize. You've got millions of refugees in Turkey that are causing enormous social sort of tensions. It's not the fault of the refugees, it's just the way it's played out. And so I don't believe Erdogan thought, well, we're gonna go down to Hama and Homs and Damascus. And it was a function of both the exhaustion of the Syrian army, 4 years of hard sanctions, people's exhaustion with war, decapitation of Hezbollah. And there's probably been a bit of backdoor stuff going on that we don't know about. But yeah, in terms of it being coordinated, I'm skeptical, but I also understand why people think, this is kind of a joint US, Israeli, Turkish sort of maneuver. But I'm not personally seeing that way, but I could be very, very wrong.
Yeah, no, I was more thinking that Russia had a quiet word and said, we're not going to continue supporting this, so you might as well
Mhm.
call it a day. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was frustration from Moscow with Assad for not normalizing. Russia's
Mm.
bogged down in Ukraine. They had to get out of Nagorno-Karabakh, what, just over a year ago.
Mm.
So there could have been something, I suspect, similar to you, that there was something going back channels with Russia and other regional players
Mm.
in particular that led to their withdrawal.
And I think it's probably one of those things that we'll look back on as more inevitable maybe than people had given it credit for. In that, once you put together the Ukraine kind of quagmire, the expenditure that Russia's putting into that, and the degree to which they had kind of military, necessary kind of interoperability and air support, and then you subtract Hezbollah based on Israel's pretty, I think, unquestionably devastating attack on that command structure, then what's left, right? You kind of taken away two pillars of the stool. So it was maybe you could see it as a matter of time from a kind of brute military standpoint.
Yeah, I think the environment that was created, obviously led to this rapid collapse. But there's multiple, it's not just one thing, as you've noted. It also goes back to sanctions, not being able to rebuild the Syrian economy, reconstruct the country. So a lot of pressures have been deliberately created on Syria particularly the past 4 years. But, this is a long, very long, grinding, brutal war. And, 13, 14 years in, perhaps it just was inevitable.
And it's one of those things where, I mean, you can go even further back, right? And say, with countries where the US chooses to intervene, chooses to enforce sanctions, chooses to perhaps first attempt normalization with a regime, and then turn on them once that regime decides it doesn't want anything with what the US is doing. And this happens again and again in the Middle East in particular, and I think in Africa as well, where they just are happy to destroy an entire nation, and with no care for the civilians, while having this incredibly narrow focus on the leadership, and how tyrannical and how horrific they are, and like as we were talking about before we started recording, that doesn't mean anything. That's like meaningless in terms of the material realities that often the US has intentionally created
Mhm.
with the way that they treat geopolitics in the region, and then use that to punish an entire civilian population for decades via sanctions, via the funding of armed extremist groups, via all manner of destabilization. Eventually, a country that is in that situation is going to collapse.
Mhm.
That like military or otherwise, it is going to become a failed state because that is the intent. That is the design is to ensure that happens while maintaining enough arm's length, plausible deniability to say it wasn't really you. It was the way it was managed by this brutal regime.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think about in blue water imperialism, like overseas imperialism, is that it is more ruthless without any animus. So, if you look at, say, Saddam Hussein's regime, he was a very brutal man, but he didn't kill as many Iraqis as the US empire did. And if you look at an example I wanted to use was Tipu Sultan, and who was, a hate figure for the British, whose name is still used as a kind of a demonized name of a crooked, brutal despot. His brutality did not match that of the British Empire at all, but the British Empire's brutality wasn't personalized. It was this bureaucratized thing where if there was a crop failure, you still keep exporting the crops and you let millions of people starve to death and that sort of thing. So I think this is one of the factors when we think about the future for the people of Syria. The extension of US power there is actually quite a bad thing.
Absolutely. And on that kind of, yeah, I guess kind of imperialist note, I think that's something that at least is not kind of missing in this narrative. I think most people kind of reading these stories understand that there's this undertone of foreign influence in a way that I think maybe however many 13 years ago, 2011, there was less of an understanding that there was quite a kind of undercurrent of foreign interests involved, shall we say, in the kind of the memory of the Arab Spring onwards, as Glenn was saying to start with. But just kind of following on from that, I was wondering, Glenn, how you see that kind of playing out in terms of different currents, because I think there are different ways you could see that. I'm not asking you to predict the future, but in terms of the different interests involved, let's say, there's obviously regional powers like Turkey, as you've said, Israel, it's just kind of untrammeled invading at the moment, it seems, in a way that just is wild to me. It's just a full scale invasion. And then you have kind of regional kind of soft power influences, potentially like Iran and, Saudi in a financial sense. And then obviously the big bad, the United States. But I was just wondering how you saw those different forces interacting, because it's a bit of a mixed, it's a bit of a, it's a bunch of cats in a bag, right? How does that shake out in terms of on the ground reality for the people who actually live there, right?
First, I think it was 8 wartime trips through Syria, and I'd been maybe a dozen times before the so-called Arab Spring. So I went back into Syria at the end of 2012 and into Aleppo. The rebels, what was in the Free Syrian Army and a profusion of other militias, had swept in July 2012 and started looting these class dynamics. But it was very clear that the opposition was radicalizing. So you'd see groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Salafi political organization, wants to establish a global caliphate. Their activists out, people chanting "Forever the Prophet is our leader." Very different to what you'd see in Egypt initially, which was, bread, freedom, etc. And so you had the regional players you've pointed out: Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, also Qatar. The Muslim Brotherhood was very active, very close to Turkey. And yeah, they sort of, for example, with the exception of Iran and the Hezbollah, those arrayed regional forces were on the same side, but they were also competing because Saudi Arabia doesn't want the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, to build substantial influence. So in a way, they sort of inflamed the situation, like feeding off each other for influence, And then you had other non-state groups, so Al Qaeda in Iraq, which rebranded to the Islamic State in Iraq, and then in 2011, Abu Bakr Baghdadi sent Jolani, the leader of HTS. So this was an Al Qaeda franchise renamed from Iraq to Syria, along with 4 or 5 other emissaries to assess the logistics and feasibility of establishing a formal Al Qaeda network in Syria. And so they did that at the end of 2011. So then you had another non-state regional actor coming in and complicating it. There was a lot of tension between Al Qaeda's Central Command and Baghdadi, which led to Baghdadi splitting off and establishing what people know as ISIS. So yeah, regionally there's a lot going on. Broader geopolitics. Britain and France were also active. That goes back to Sykes-Picot, rebuilding neocolonial influence. And then you had the broad competition between Russia backing Assad and the United States, basically. So yeah, there's very broad dynamics, and all the while it was leading to radicalization, increasing death tolls. So the first year of the rebellion, you had about 4,000 civilians killed. When I got there in November 2012, it had jumped to about 20,000, and it jumped to 72,000, and it just kept getting, until it was just horrible and, just unbelievable kinds of violence that we were seeing.
How does this play into the wider, I guess, imperialism in the Middle East at the moment? So, you said, Glenn, that you don't feel that there was really any coordination here among the countries now kind of carving Syria up. But with both what's happening, well, with the Israeli kind of military policy and the genocide in Gaza and the increasing escalations in the West Bank and everywhere else, while the US has forces parked everywhere. Countries like Jordan working in concert with Israel to block incoming missiles and drones. How does this like rapid collapse of the Syrian state impact that wider geopolitical situation?
Yeah, it's different. I mean, it's going to take time. What I've been surprised at so far is how rapidly we've began seeing summary executions, etc. Some people say that's to be expected, but already the kinds of violence we're seeing, it took a good sort of 4 or 5 months in Libya for you to get all these major revenge killings. There are some big examples, the executions of the Tuareg outside Tripoli, etc. But Libya took time to devolve into complete chaos. Whereas Syria, I think we're seeing kind of spectacular acts of violence that show what's going to go forward. If Turkey insists on staying in there, if Israel insists on staying in there, if, as Keir Starmer's saying, the British should be seeking a role in Syria, all they're going to do is just prolong the war, escalate it again. This is so more broadly, I think it might be a bit utopian, but all these foreign players for the good of Syria need to get out. And yet there'll still be bloodletting, but Syrians have to decide this themselves. But even then, you've got the problem of the Uyghur militias, the Chechen fighters. So it's very complex, but I think the West should be pulling back and perhaps leaving it to international bodies, as much as we've tried to undermine the UN over the past year, to try and resolve this. I think if at the very beginning of the insurgency, if the US had allowed the UN to take the lead, so these are the Geneva 1 and 2 meetings, we might have avoided this altogether, but the US sort of got in there and stopped negotiations, reasonable negotiations happening. So short answer, I think we're in for a lot of bloodshed, a lot more, which is just horrible.
What about the split? I mean, you're comparing it with Libya, but the country's already split. Surely HTS is not going to be able to consolidate control over all of Syria, are they?
Yeah, you've still got the Shabiha. So it depends how they behave. If they behave reasonably, which I don't think they will, the leadership will try and present this moderate, reformed position, but we're already seeing it. You've got some. I met a child soldier in Aleppo who was 11 years old 10 years ago. Got an entire generation that have come of age in this context. They'd lived with Salafi Jihad Central. Those people have been thoroughly indoctrinated. So yeah, if they act responsibly, you won't see other ethnic and sectarian groups pushing back. If they don't, well, of course it's gonna go off. I don't think Turkey or the US or Israel can control the forces that have been unleashed in Syria.
Well, this is part of why Israel has moved in and sought to secure their border, as the terms they've used, increase their occupation of a large chunk of Syria against international law. In reality, I think the people around Syria, the states, are very aware of what a powder keg it's going to become. You mentioned Jelani, the head of HTS, this major jihadi group. What has been psychotic to witness, alongside what you've just outlined about how quickly the executions have started, how quickly the bloodletting has begun, is in the last week this incredible puff piece campaign by Western media to paint Jelani as somehow this reformist who just went down the wrong path previously and is now fully embraced liberalism, and he's there to free all Syrians. Immediately, the lie has been given to that, and you've seen no resiling from Western media of that just yet. Although I imagine if, the US and other imperial powers decide, actually, we want to blow this guy up too, that will swiftly change.
I mean, terrorist designated, right? Let's not forget, this kind of gives the lie, as Carl was implying, to the pretext of the sanctity of these international designations and designations of individuals and organizations as terrorists, is that these things are entirely pragmatic, right? And we've, leftists have known this since these designations were invented. Look at Nelson Mandela, right? But it's such a clear explanation and explication of these kind of legal concepts and precepts when as Kieran's written about like really cogently, I think, when the time comes, these things can flip, right? Like the purpose of these things are political, not legal. So designating an individual or a terrorist in relation to the Western hegemon is like that is the purpose of it, right? It's used as a cudgel when it's necessary. And then you do the you give them the who's that? Who's the Saudi prince whose name I'm forgetting?
MBS,
Thank
Mohammed
you.
bin Salman.
MBS, yeah.
You give them the MBS treatment, when the time comes.
Yeah.
Bone saws be damned, right? Like it's just, it's utility, right? And this is such a perfect explanation of that. And there are people kind of pretending that quote unquote neoliberal jihadism is an incoherent concept. It's not incoherent. That shit has been rife in the Middle East for anyone who's been paying attention for a long time. Like, where do you think Wahhabism came from? That's not a nationalist sentiment, and the money comes from somewhere, right? I don't know, Glenn, you may disagree, but I think that's been a strand that's been around for decades and decades and has like a well storied and moneyed history in my opinion.
Well, yeah, with the radicalization of the opposition, there was a lot of pushback in 2012, throughout 2012, even into 2013 from Western media. I know a lot of reporters, and there was a lot of denialism. And when it became inescapable, they sort of accepted it. But now, yeah, the revisionism regarding Giuliani, perhaps he has reformed. I don't see it in the context of Idlib. I really don't. And I don't see it in his personal context, Al Qaeda in Iraq, setting up Jabhat al-Nusra, the former Al-Qaeda franchise. I think it was rebranded again in 2015 and again recently.
The fact we're even talking about rebranding of these organizations, right, is just ludicrous.
Oh, same what you see it in Ukraine with Azov,
Yeah.
So yeah, it depends on utility, whether the utility to Western powers, whether or not something will be deemed as a terrorist or not, and this is so blatant. It's sad to see. But this is just how Western power works. There's no logical consistency or ethics it's just very opportunistic and predatory.
Well, I think that in a couple of centuries' time, the way we're going to look at this is in another part in a long series of US takeover of the Arabic world, particularly the Middle East. So, a lot of the small countries, they haven't needed to conquer them. The smaller or poorer countries, or more easily swayed countries, and they just they're just client states. But the ones that stand in their way, they eventually will attack them through basically what I would call genocidal means aimed at destroying the society itself, rather than simply fighting their army. And I think that Syria is just another example of that. And the US was never going to allow the UN to find a peaceful solution to things, because it wanted an outcome that was harmful to the state of Syria as a whole.
One of the first things we saw, on everyone's favorite social media app, Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, was soldiers, US soldiers, posting them running up flags in and around the oil fields in the east of Syria. It was like absolutely absurd. Like that, it's got to the point where they're not even looking for plausible deniability anymore. They've occupied parts of that region to control parts of agriculture and fossil fuel extraction for a fair while now. But to be out there just on social media, posting like we've secured this area, like is the US at war? I mean, they haven't declared it. They're not claiming that they are. They clearly are.
That's why I thought the analogy with the East India Company taking over India and beyond is quite good, really, because it was all none of it was an official conquest. It was actually when things got incredibly bad that people, as a humanitarian measure, the British government took over and said, well, we own it, we better look after it. And of course, they didn't do a good job of that, naturally. But I feel something very similar is happening now. And yes, it is a process that takes so long that it almost seems invisible while it's happening. But I think that's the way the future will look at this.
And on that, like, I guess on that kind of not national, historic kind of viewpoint, I was wondering, Glenn, if you could give us your opinion of, I think the kind of, from a geopolitical standpoint, the obvious question is what happened to the secular nationalists, right? There were a few decades there, more than a few, there were several decades there where that seemed to be like a genuine, if not power block, then at least drive, right? In the Middle East, Western Asia, to a lesser extent, maybe Egypt, there were at least like significant minorities in a bunch of these countries. And this feels like kind of the final nail in the coffin in terms of that kind of power block. I was just wondering what you thought of that kind of axis.
Well, the Ba'ath Party, the Resurrection Party, they did dabble in Arab nationalism, but they were always Syria. Under Sykes-Picot, historic Syria was carved up. So Transjordan went, Palestine went, parts of Lebanon went. I think it was the 30s that Alexandria went. So that's modern day Hatay, Antakya in Turkey. So you had this sort of, I guess, rump state, for lack of a better word. So they did dabble in Arab nationalism with Gamal Abdel Nasser, even formed a union with him. But they were always going to be economically inferior, which means they're going to be politically inferior. So there wasn't really a place for them in the Arab nationalist movement. That's why they looked abroad. So you have Arab nationalism at home, but your allies, you're protected. Well, not protected. Your allies are the Soviet Union. The Ba'ath were Arab nationalists, socialist, pan-Arabic, and anti-imperialist. But there's also like local dynamics where those labels don't really sort of capture what's going on. And Hafez al-Assad, he did liberalize a bit, and definitely when after what's his name Basil al-Assad, his oldest son died, and succession was passed to Bashar. And he was allowed by the regime, the Alawite-dominated regime, to enact some reforms which were very neoliberal and were very detrimental to Syria. Does that answer your question a bit? Or?
Yeah, no, 100%. That's kind of what I was wondering, is where you thought that had landed. And then I guess the second half of that question is Syria's obviously been a very divided nation for the entirety of its history, even officially, like religiously, ethnically, class, etc. And based on this kind of brutal shakeup, how do you think that's gonna? Because that obviously took a long time to kind of, settled is probably the wrong word, but took a long time to kind of figure out how those different power bases would relate politically.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think this is going to do? This kind of violent shakeup of power dynamics. I know we're very early and it's kind of the beginning of the pool game, but if it's possible to kind of forecast how the balls will end up, I'm just curious what you think.
Well, yeah, I guess that depends on how much actual power everyday Syrians or what's the word, agency they're allowed to have. That might sound condescending, but there are broader powers working in there right now that are determined that I think that if it's left in the hands of Syrians, if the brutal international politics don't further complicate it, there'll still be local conflicts and politics, but at least they've got a chance. My view on Syria was always, this is a country with an extremely long history. Let them sort it out. Let them, which is why I was so opposed to what the West and Turkey, etc., were doing, particularly from 2012 onwards. I honestly have no idea where it's going to go, or what's going to come out of this. The West, the US is waging a three-front war right now. One against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy. Ukraine's similar to Syria. It's got regional, local, and big geopolitical aspects. It's waging another one in the Middle East, basically, I think, as a revenge for the Al-Aqsa flood operation, which temporarily shattered normalization of Israel with the Arab states. And it's building another conflict in the Asia-Pacific region as we speak. It's just in the Philippines, and it's pretty clear what's starting to happen. So I've gone off track, sorry. Yeah.
Could I actually just rewind a bit? I was just going to comment first that like Hafez al-Assad sort of turned it from a one-party state into a kind of cult of personality dictatorship, and then handed off to he started a dynastic succession. So it kind of lost some of the Ba'athist character. But how would you characterize the Alawi domination of the government system in Syria, and what do you think it means for the future of Alawi people in Syria?
Well, I think in some ways, it's sort of the reverse image of what's going on presently with in northern Syria. So Assad, this is Hafez, so the government they'd have their representatives from the Sunni community, but the Mukhabarat, the whole sort of structure behind it was stacked with Alawites. This was the technique they used. Similarly, we've kind of seen almost a reverse or similar thing, or the reverse happening with Jolani, where they're trying to present a moderate image while behind it you've got this major, the Salafi jihadists, then the regional powers, the different power brokers, the Ikhwan, etc. For the Alawites, I really hope that we're not going to see ethnic cleansing, or the genocide of the Alawites. Those people that are part of the Mukhabarat, etc., that were integral to the system of really quite totalitarian oppression, they need to be held to account. What I'm hoping is it's not going to turn into a slaughter. That's my principal concern right now. And maybe it won't, maybe it will. We just don't know.
I want to zoom out a bit and just have a quick discussion about imperialism, because I think that's really one of the key kind of considerations here. And I want to start on a point that you were making with your analogy around the East India Company, Kieran, because we really are getting to a point where the US military is like this giant corporate that's just going out. And, we talk about the military-industrial complex, etc., for the last so many decades. But they're capturing resource first and foremost. And I think in both Ukraine and now in Syria, just, days after the fall of the Assad regime, putting a call out for innovative funding to help revitalize the Syrian economy, this really absurd venture capital styled neoliberal corporatism that I guess you can trace back to places like Iraq, where Halliburton and other big US construction firms kind of swooped in and picked up these multi-billion-dollar construction contracts to air quotes rebuild. And we're seeing that happen in regards to vulture capital, I think, in Ukraine with groups like BlackRock and the like showing interest via stuff like AI and automation. And now this similar call immediately going out for Syria. Obviously it doesn't work, but what do we think about the overall kind of imperial creep that just seems incredibly clear to me in this particular case?
Well, just going back a little bit, looking at US imperialism and its relationship to capital. I just want to point out that in Indochina, they kind of sold people on the idea of invading and making money, and then promptly bombed all the assets. So it wasn't really a way of making money, but they started kind of creating this way of also profiteering through war. And then they kind of did that in Iraq as well. And really, it almost became a system because they passed a law in the US saying that none of the companies that operated in Iraq could be held accountable under US law, and they passed law in Iraq saying none of the companies could be held accountable under Iraqi law, so the extraterritoriality. So they literally had no laws ruling them at all, and they could do whatever they wanted, which would be sometimes the US would fly in money and they'd fly it straight back out and say, thank you very much, more or less. I mean, might be slightly simplifying that. So yeah, when they part of the process is getting the forces of capital on board. It's not necessarily done for them. They are part of the social structure of the imperial center, so you have to give them their bit to get them on board. So that's what I would say about that. I could also mention the role of oil in the whole thing as well, if people are interested, because again, the oil is a strategic asset. So yes, you can make money off it, but it also allows you to project power onto people. And they used to say that the US dollar, well, because it was the only way in which to buy oil, you needed US dollar reserves. They called it the petrodollar recycling scheme, and they used to say that once it went off gold, the US dollar was backed by the F-14. And so their control of oil is not for their own use. It's not for them to take it out of the ground and exploit it. It's to control other people. And it can be very profitable leaving it in the ground. As we saw in Iraq, the huge profits made by ExxonMobil particularly, but all of the major oil majors, they made huge profits when the oil wasn't available, when it was under threat, because it pushes up the price so much. So yes, now they are exploiting Iraq's oil, but really that's almost the afterthought to the whole scheme. So yeah, how much that applies to Syria, maybe you'd have something to say about that.
Yeah, well, I understand the link between imperialism and resource extraction. But for example, in Libya, the campaign, people thought it was about stealing Libyan oil. It wasn't. It was about shaping the world to the West's liking, in my opinion. So Gaddafi was insufficiently compliant. There was an opportunity to get rid of him, so they did. And in Syria, is it about oil? I don't think so. Again, it's a regime that's been tricky to deal with, that is a part of the Axis, and the opportunity to shape the world, to dominate that region, to get rid of pesky regimes is driving, I believe, was driving, the US's sort of positioning on Syria the past decade, at least, well, since the beginning of the uprising there. So I agree, yeah, that resource extraction, imperialism are very closely linked, but the hegemon is also willing to just, Libya's been chaos for 14 years. They're willing to topple a non-compliant regime, throw the country to hell if it, no, to hell with the consequences, as long as they're shaping the world and maintaining primacy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was going to say they're often talked about in the same breath, right? Hegemony and imperialism, but they don't necessarily have the same intent in terms of the reasons for the US to do things. Sometimes they do things that are seemingly against their strategic interests in service of that. That said, there's also this, you mentioned, Glenn, the US has a war open on three fronts, or is at least attempting to do that, like as a teetering hegemon, as multipolarity looks to try and establish itself. US primacy demands that they create a bulwark against China, and perhaps to just destroy that bulwark altogether. We've seen, like, for the last, 5 years, like an escalating rhetoric across the West, of xenophobia, of anti-China rhetoric just in general. And some of these attacks on regimes are perhaps strategic in the sense that we need to get rid of the thorns in our side, if we're going to open up a bigger front with one of the states, one of the nations that is looking to take a pole position.
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct. So going back to the Arab Spring, Syria was the end point. That's where the Arab Spring died. Bahrain was put down by Saudi Arabia. The NATO intervention into Libya, Yemen, a very complex process in Yemen, but it resulted in basically a half a decade bombing campaign, or even more, by the Saudis. So yeah, there is shaping going on. I think it's very obvious, and in Eastern Europe, etc. The military infrastructure that's gone in there since 2017, and what's going on in the Asia Pacific right now, particularly in the Philippines. So yeah, they're definitely shaping up for it. Yeah, will it succeed? I hope not, but I think it will. I can see ultimately, Russia's is winning this war in Ukraine very clearly. It's been devastating for the Ukrainians. But after what we've just seen in the Levant, I wouldn't discount a few surprises,
I was wondering, shifting slightly from, I guess industrial imperial argument to the lawfare slash international bodies argument. I was wondering, um, maybe Kieran, maybe Glenn, probably both, what you thought of the role of various kind of international organizations in this kind of both the situation specifically, but also their kind of ideological function. Because Glenn, you mentioned the UN before and kind of international cooperation, but I wonder what that would look like in this context, right? Not through any kind of pessimistic or like nihilistic kind of drive, but I just wonder what that would end up looking like on the ground somewhere that's so contested regionally, nationally, like the kind of international legal role of the functions. Maybe Glenn, you could kick us off with your kind of thoughts on that, and then Kieran, I'd be interested in your like ruminations on how that could shake out from a legal perspective as well.
Yeah, well, in terms of Geneva 1 and Geneva 2, I think what we saw was a good deal of the Libya playbook copied on to Syria. And key to that was demanding that Assad had any role to play. Just like they did in Libya, Gaddafi offered to negotiate repeatedly. This was refused by this, what was it, the National Transitional Council. And so in Libya, you had these foreign-sponsored outside governments, the Libyan Transitional Council. In Syria, you had a very similar thing, the Syrian National Council. And what the US was doing was saying, Assad is a lion in the sand for us. It's very childish. Get rid of the leader. Get rid of the leader. This shows that we've won. And I think that was really one of the major causes Syria really escalated is the West's childish view of politics. We don't like this leader. Get rid of him. Well, they should have. I know Kofi Annan wanted, to leave space to negotiate a transition away from Assad over time. But the US, first Hillary Clinton did it, and then John Kerry at Geneva 2. And that's very puerile politics that the West needs to be, well, the US in particular needs to be hauled up on. You have to negotiate with your enemies. You can't demand unconditional surrender before defeat. Like,
and this is what's happening with Russia right now, right?
Yeah, I guess to an extent, yeah, they've got to get out. They could just leave Ukraine. So, well, they're not going to. And it's ridiculous to expect them to. Despite the war being illegal, it's still just not realistic in terms of negotiating an end to you can't just say get out. So, well, give us a reason.
From my perspective, I think that the US is never, well, at least not since the Korean War, it's never engaged in negotiations in the way you might be suggesting here that they were doing it in good faith. I don't think they believe in good faith. They find pretexts to avoid a peaceful outcome, such as happened in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. They did everything possible to make sure that nothing could derail their plans there. So in a way, to me, it seems almost strange to talk about them changing their behavior in that respect. Mm-hmm. And also, you look at situations like Syria, for me, it's hard to imagine how the international community could get a look in, could do something to stop the disaster that was happening. I think we do need a massive change in the power, international power, the way international power works. And I wonder if maybe the breakthrough might come from the current discontent around the genocide in Gaza and the obvious hypocrisy and unwillingness to end an unjustifiable slaughter that's going on now, and people realizing that they can't keep giving veto power to the US and the United States, the Security Council, for example. Yeah.
I mean, I agree completely. Like, I don't think the US was acting in good faith at all in Libya and Syria. They were doing, like you say, and in Iraq. They present the facade of being open to negotiations, but all the time their lines in the sand made negotiation impossible and war inevitable.
Just like Israel's doing now, right? With
So yeah, what do we need? I think we need an international coalition to go in, intervene in Israel. We need the US. I mean, this is utopian stuff, but the US needs to be beat down, basically. But it's not going to happen.
Xi Jinping, if you're listening, yeah, you're letting the US wrap up all its problems, and you're not doing anything about it, and they're coming for you next. So make the international coalition, get into Israel, and make them stop. You heard it here first, folks.
Your priorities straight, Carl. Number one, G, if you're listening, subscribe to the Patreon. We'll create a tier just for you. We appreciate your subscriber listenership and all your patronage. And then number two, yes, of course, save the world.
Hey, let's give it a wrap there. Thank you so much for joining us, Glen Johnson.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Kieran Kelly.
Well, thank you very much.
And my co-host Philip. Second podcast of the day.
Kia ora, that was awesome. Thanks so much, Glenn. Thanks so much, Kieran. That was awesome. So nice to have people with like actual experience talking about things that they've lived through and that they've seen in first person and read about. It's always fascinating. I just appreciate your scholarship so much.
If you've enjoyed this, like, share, subscribe. We know like a lot of people out there asking what the fuck is happening in Syria. Hopefully this has given you an hour-long crib notes to kind of give you some context, give you some ideas about the situation there, why and what is happening. We know that many people who listen to us really struggling with the way that legacy media is presenting these big geopolitical issues because of the way that Western hegemony is currently being utilized through those media organizations. If you've heard people saying that to you and asking you about where to find information, send them a link to this. Let them know that there is media out there that is trying to give, I'm not going to say objective, but a more material analysis, a clearer set of facts about what is happening in the world and helping us understand it. So like, share, subscribe as usual. Flick us some money at the Patreon. If you like what we do and you want to see us do more of it, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, we might have 3 different podcasts out, maybe 4 over a week-long period. That is a rarity. We would love to be releasing more episodes about more issues that our audience wants to hear and wants to know about. So help us out. We'll be back with episodes about New Zealand domestic politics coming up. We'll be back with current events on the weekend, and we'll catch you then.
If artificers are denied, living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticize a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.